Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, so my talk takes a little bit of a different tack. I'm kind of talking from a pedagogical standpoint since that's my main focus these days. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is something I'm calling Typographic Dissent, which borrows its title from the book The Design of Dissent, which was written by Milton Glaser and Mirko Ilic in 2015. And really what I want to look at is the idea of dissent as a lens to look at the history of typography and how that might be useful to us in teaching students about typography and the power of it as a cultural tool. So this started with this very quick design that I made last year in the height of the aftermath of the election for the Resist and Persist local chapter, which my friend started, which is called Project Leia. And I just wanted to make something that basically kind of got to this visceral connection between typography and language and make the letterforms do something that express something. And in doing that and kind of researching around the subject, and that was a very fast response, I just started to think about that idea that a fast response for me as a typographer, but more broadly for the layperson, is to go to our written word to express ourselves. And I looked at the work of pop artist Karita Kent, who makes use of color and typography to create connections between words and engage the viewer in an active discovery. And that kind of set me down a track. Which led me to consider what a look at the practice and history of typography made in service of dissent and public engagement might afford to both the practice of typography or practicing typographers and type designers, but also to students. So in this talk, I'm talking about typography more broadly as just something that is a mark, impression, or image of writing. So some of the things I'm going to show are not typography or printed type. And dissent as something, just the use of typography to different sentiments disagree or be at odds with, but not necessarily in a disagreeable way. It could be just to assert something. And then kind of drilling down a little bit more, the idea of dissent as, or typographic dissent as being intradisciplinary or extradisciplinary. So looking at typography within the discipline to challenge the status quo. So that could be what we would call maybe the avant-garde. So examples of that might be the modernist rejection of the idiosyncrasies of craft and nationalism, or the Dadaist rejection of rules-based design and the notion of order. And then extradisciplinarily, typography in use in the public sphere. So the use of the typographic code or type technologies harnessed as a mass-producible code, a shield, or a semblance of authority to challenge the status quo. So basically, that means that I'm trying to argue for the idea of the dissenting lens as something that we can use to investigate typography, and something that allows us to reflect on the operational mechanisms of typography as a visual verbal mode, and something that lets us revisit the role of language and its physical description in design, and lastly, to have a look at the ideologies that might inform our practice. All of which is useful for a teacher because it helps us to teach students about the context of their work, how it operates and what kinds of cultural cues it pulls on, the agency of typography and thus responsibility of typographers, and what can be achieved when there is an investment on the part of the typographer in the subject matter that they're working with. So basically, I'm saying that typography or the typography of dissent embodies and highlights three fundamental mechanisms of typographic design more broadly. Typography as a visual voice, typography as access, and typography as a cultural artifact that has ideological stances embedded in it. So by visual voice, I'm talking about the kinds of visual rhetoric information that's embedded in the shapes themselves, the close connection between typography and language that happens when we dissent with typography, and how typography can afford identity and anonymity, as well as giving authority to a message and amplifying it. In terms of access, obviously typography is based on a base level that we are literate in some way, so not having access to that denies us access to a cultural conversation, but also providing communication tools and the implications of what McLuhan describes as the making of typographic man, so what typography has done to change the way we consider our role in society and communicate. And then, as I said, typography as a cultural artifact that holds within it examples of social change or the intent of the designer to either clarify a message or through obfuscation ask the user to engage with it. So Johanna Drucker in The Visual Word describes typography's most potent aspect as being its refusal to resolve into either a visual or a verbal mode. And I think that you can see that in these examples from the book Posters for Peace, which was also printed in 2015, which is a collection of posters made in May 1970 in response to civil unrest. And both of these are examples of how typography and visuals merge together, which is obviously related to the work of Guillaume Apollinaire, who looked at articulating the mechanism by which typography can operate when form and meaning fuse. But typography as dissent, as a voice, also kind of makes explicit the connection between language and our imperative to express ourselves. So this is a poster, again, taken from the design of Dissent called Don't, which was an attempt to rebuff a campaign to discourage violence against Malaysian women by urging modesty. And you can see that the verb here becomes front and center important, and the same verb here in this other example, I do, which supports same-sex marriage from 2004. So both of those highlight the verb, and in doing so showcase the mechanism by which typographic design can place language and the content of the message front and center. And I really like this example, which uses the the very distinctly typographic rather than written language aspect of punctuation to thwart the meaning of this image. So we go from immoral to I'm moral. So of all the codes that we communicate in, the written word still seems to hold a privileged position as being the confluence of concept and form, a code afforded to anyone with a mark-making tool and accessible to anyone literate, which is something that Candy Chang reflects on in these two posters. So Rick Porner in the Design Observer article, Why the Activist Poster is Here to Stay, says that activist posters come from a seemingly irrepressible urge to broadcast a firmly held opinion using graphic resources, which I think is embodied in this image. But also typography as access can be something that gives us an anonymity that provides kind of shelter in the crowd, and I think you can see that in this example by Ken Garland from Typography Papers 8, where the voices of the crowd, that idea of the voices of the crowd being distilled and given force by anonymity, is shown through the repeated use of the peace sign, which is a kind of a typographic shape in itself, moving through a modular grid as though it's a march. And also the idea of typography providing anonymity is something that the Guerrilla Girls in their movement play with, and that gets to the idea of access and the availability of ideas, which Meredith Davis describes as recalling the work of anonymous printers who produce volumes of work without the assistance of designers, a fitting approach for a group that does not reveal the identities of its members and takes political action to the streets. And lastly, the idea of access is something that was explored in this poster from 1998, where the Sharing Jerusalem Two Capitals project was tackled in this design, which obscures the meaning of the word equal to get at the idea that there is an impossibility of achieving agreement on that definition. And this poster, which was a translation of the War is Over poster made in 1969, only translated into Amharic in 2010, showing that typography also provides access to a global conversation. And in the book Posters for Peace, Joe Austin describes the role of writing graffiti as being part of the larger, dispersed and ongoing struggle for public space among marginalized groups in the US, where writing quickly became a forum for social criticism. A graffito is always evidence of an event. And so these are examples where I think the ability of typography to assert an identity and create a cultural conversation becomes important. So this is the work of Mazer in Dublin, in Ireland. And you can see on the right-hand side there that there's a 24-hour manned security sign in the middle of the word you, and the typographic arrangement around that is reflecting on it. So there's a kind of a cultural conversation being started by using the authority of typographic form to reflect on the typographic signs in the environment. And then on the left, this sort of drab car park is reclaimed through the use of ornamental typography in sign painting form. And then this work from Espo Powers in Brooklyn borrows the typographic language and form from Gotham and Knockout, two typefaces made in New York and referencing the vernacular of New York to establish an identity for the local community and have a conversation with them. So the typographic code affords us a set of shapes to give form to that involvement even when not a designer, and Maud Levin, in Who Gets to Say What to Whom in Citizen Designer, says that the flexing of visual voice muscles is a key to the concept of radical democracy, which emphasizes citizens' egalitarian involvement in debate, representation, change, and government. So the ability to assert a stance with the buffer of a semblance of mass communication, separating the source from the outcomes or harnessing typographic form for shelter, is something that's kind of explored in these two posters by Stephen Heller and Carrie Jacobs. And this poster, also taken from the book Posters for Peace, shows a typographic exploration, a form of visual poetry accompanying a picture of Ralph Ginsberg, which shows iconography and typography fusing together as one composition. And Ginsberg also worked with Herb Lubalin on Fact magazine, a primarily typographic publication whose serifed masthead suggests authority, and the name itself lends itself to the concept underpinning the layouts that typography can speak visually with authority. And Maria Popova, in her article, Ralph Ginsberg's Fact Vintage WikiLeaks, with the tagline Inconvenient Truths or What Groundbreaking Typography Has to Do with the Justice System, says that this collaboration brought a new level of credibility to the role of designer as an editorial, not just aesthetic visionary. Dadaist typography is the iconic example of typographic dissent, both interdisciplinarily and extradisciplinarily, as it describes and asserts a cultural chaos as well as breaking with the previous conventions of typography. More recently, the First Things First manifesto the self-reflection of the latter half of the last century resulted in the First Things First manifesto and its revisiting, which utilizes neutral typography to assert a collective voice while harnessing the weightiness and authority of both the power of the words first things first as well as their form. The blueprint for counter-education kind of fuses all of these ideas together as an alternative to education, where you use these three posters and you are supposed to kind of navigate the starting points on the posters and add to them. And the design work by Marshall Heinrichs utilizes typography to assert its nature as a countercultural experimental publication, showcasing the use of typography to evoke meanings through type choices, to create relationships between ideas, and to invite engagement. Although the fact of typographic authority seems to have thwarted that last intention, the idea was that people could write on the posters and make them and expand the learning outcomes, but actually what ended up happening, and this was reflected on in the box set, was that they were framed and put on people's walls. So typography as authority is something that is not something we can avoid. And Jonathan Barnbrook is a well-known typographic dissenter, gaining recognition for his work with Adbusters and reflecting a cognizance that typography is both well-situated for impact and because of this responsible to society. Barnbrook works with typography and typeface design to effect change, as evidenced in this specimen from his site showing the false idol and Prozac typefaces, each of which is intended to make a statement about society. To him, as Emily Gosling notes in her article, a typeface series should improve society as part of a wider utopian aim, such as those set out by Bauhaus designers like Herbert Bayer, who designed the proposal for universal type in the late 1920s. And this unpublished undergraduate typeface designed by my student Sam Dunbelow references that kind of stance on the making of typography, and this was also worked on in fall 2017, so right at the heart of the build a wall rhetoric. And he wanted to make a typeface that was based on Mexican sign painting, and in the specimen he subtly alludes to the kind of rhetoric at the time and tries to counteract it. So the glyph set, the alternative glyph set, does not include alternative facts. And this type family by my friend Octavio Pardo, the Tiananmen Font Project, was a type design intended for typographic dissent and offered as a free font for use in the public sphere. Similarly, Tyler Galloway's Praxis Typeface Thesis Project is a type family designed to be accompanied by these stencils so that the community can use them to take action. So looking at typographic dissent lets us look at the nuts and bolts of how typography operates and takes us on a journey through the history of typographic experiment and dissent. From a pedagogical standpoint, this provides an opportunity to immerse the student in a basis of history, principle, and cultural context in order to provide an understanding of expectations to thwart and conventions to harness. And Johanna Drucker, again in Figuring the Word, says that the features which function to distinguish experimental work from commercial or fine printing are best understood by contrast as a function of difference rather than inherence. And that's really what I'm getting at with this. I think that by showing students what happens when somebody has a really strong message that they want to get out and the agency that typography affords them, they stop thinking about following rules and they start thinking about what they want to say. So this is just some of our students in Paris last year looking at the Guerrilla Girls. So this allows them to engage with context and see how they can harness previous typographic experiments and tropes for rhetorical impact, to recognize the responsibility and agency of artifacts, and to see what investment can provide. So with that in mind, I'm just going to show you two projects. I gave my students a prompt of just typographic dissent with the intention that they would think about the concept and what it led them to rather than, again, the formal expectations. So this is Shannon Kovach's Fifth Amendment, where she takes existing modern examples of black letter and then distorts them to try and start a conversation about the distortion of the Fifth Amendment and the freedom of speech, and then pairs it with another typeface to ask us a question to engage with. And this example by Caitlin Stanatis, I Mean No, which uses typography in a few different levels to build up the background noise, which is the word rape being repeated with letterforms, and then we have to kind of search for the content, and there are two versions, one for day and for night. And this is a bit of a shameless plug. So this past year, this is all something that I did based on one really small project, but it got me thinking about the value of typography is and how we can harness that for teaching students. And I've seen what the effect of that is. The ISTD is the International Society of Typographic Designers, which some of you who maybe come from Europe might be more familiar with. And last year we launched the first US assessment, and what they do is they release briefs every year which students respond to and then submit their work to be assessed. And so these are two examples of that, and they both fall into the theme of typographic dissent. So this brief was, or this set of spreads was a response to a brief asking students to write their own manifesto. So they had to research the history of typography, look at manifestos that already existed, look at manifestos outside of design, and write their own. So all of it is self-generated. There's no outcome specified. And in doing so, Brennan Stetzer came up with this bi-directional booklet, which says two totally different things using the same typographic language. And this is the work of Emily Thomas, who researched McCarthyism with the prompt fads, and that was it, and decided to make a 6-part book series that is sewn at the edges that you have to navigate your way through to understand the complexities of the creeping sense of unease that McCarthyism led to. And you can see here that it's a typographic investigation, so it's the use of typography to research a subject matter and to explore it fully. So we leave behind the idea of an outcome and just use typography as a voice or an instrument to be played. So if you're interested in taking part in the ISTD, the briefs will be released on October 1st, and I would appreciate you getting in touch with me. And if you want more information, you can go to the istd.org.uk/education. Thank you.